This channel is part of the History Hit network. Stick around to find out more.
To some, it brought to mind the steaming jungles of the islands near the equator. But the vast Pacific Basin also includes lands which have quite a different climate and completely different terrain. In the north, the Pacific is dotted by a chain of islands lying between Japan and North America. In 1941, the Aleutians assumed a sudden, immediate importance. Of all the lands which were to become battlefields in the first truly global war, the Aleutian Islands were among the areas least suited to the conduct of successful military operations. The U.S. paid little attention to its desolate island chain before 19. These fishermen were well acquainted with the area. Since early in this century, Japanese fishing ships had worked all the waters off the Aleutians and off the Alaskan coast. Ignoring repeated U.S. protests, the Nipponese fishing fleets investigated every cove and every passage which might be of interest to the Japanese Navy one day. Throughout the area, it was felt that some of the Japanese fishermen were probably naval officers in disguise. The 30,000 Americans who populated the territory of Alaska were clustered chiefly in a few cities on the mainland. The U.S. Army was represented by some 300 soldiers on Alaska in 1939. And the Navy boasted one small base and a few light warships. The Navy maintained a single radio station in the Aleutians, which were even more lightly defended than Alaska itself. In December 1941, when the Japanese struck 2,500 miles to the south, Alaska was still virtually defenseless. With Japan's forces fanning out across the Pacific, Midway was an obvious target. So, too, was America's base in the Aleutians at Dutch Harbor. Both bases came under attack. In late May 1942, an enemy fleet moved east and sneaked in toward Dutch Harbor. On June 3rd, under cover of bad weather, the Japanese headed straight for the target, without being spotted by the American search planes, which knew the Japanese fleet was in the area. The ships continued their run until they were only 165 miles from the target. The poor weather, which proved helpful to the ships, was quite the opposite for the attacking planes. Of the planes which left the Japanese carriers for the strike at Dutch Harbor, many were subsequently forced to turn back. But those that got through, 17 planes, made it a most successful strike from the Japanese point of view. Over Dutch Harbor, the weather was good, and the pilots had no trouble finding likely targets. The tank farm, radio station, army barracks, and moored Navy planes. In 2 attacks, Dutch Harbor suffered appreciable damage to its facilities. On the west coast of the United States proper, the attack on Dutch Harbor brought the war even closer. Preparations for the defense of the nation were intensified. In the states bordering the Pacific, an enemy attack was considered imminent. Soon after the enemy strike on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese living along the west coast were quickly moved inland, away from critical defense areas. Relocation centers were hurriedly built, principally in the western states, to house some 100,000 Issei, Japanese-born aliens, and Nisei, American-born U.S. citizens of Japanese parentage. For the next 3 years, the Japanese areas of large West Coast cities were to remain deserted. In the Pacific states, defense preparations were taken with growing seriousness as enemy submarines ventured into waters just off the U.S. mainland. An enemy air attack was regarded as a distinct possibility at almost any moment.
If you love history, then you'll love History Hit. We have tons of exclusive documentaries about the most important people in history that you will not find anywhere else. From touring the fearsome Nazi seawalled fortifications to the sinking of the Bismarck. History Hit has hundreds of documentaries with access to some of the world's best military historians. Not only that, but we have a huge podcast network releasing new episodes every day, so you'll always have something to listen to. Sign up now for a 14-day free trial, and War Stories fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code WARSTORIES at checkout.
The coastal area stretching inland for 150 miles was ordered thoroughly blacked out. The simple dim out was over. Under the new ruling, not a ray of light would be visible to guide any enemy vessel offshore. Coast artillery was emplaced along the shore from the Canadian border to Mexico. The entire west coast became an armed camp. Troops by the thousands arrived and began rehearsals for combating an enemy attack. These practice operations were conducted with grim efficiency. If the Japanese should strike against U.S. coastal cities, either by air or by sea, they would receive a warm reception. The West Coast was fully alerted for any attack. From the score of camps in the states bordering the Pacific, thousands of American fighting men embarked on the first leg of their trip to the fighting fronts in the Pacific, charged with stopping the enemy's continuing advance. In the northern Pacific, a Japanese fleet carrying an occupation force moved toward the Aleutians on the second day of the strike on Dutch Harbor. The seizure of several islands in the western Aleutians would protect the enemy's northern flank and move Japanese forces into position for regular attacks against U.S. bases. Originally scheduled to occupy 3 islands, Japanese soldiers were now assigned to seize only 2, Attu and Kiska. On June 6th, while a large Japanese fleet was being defeated at Midway, the Emperor's troops went ashore at Kiska and quickly took possession of the island. With the enemy firmly situated on Kiska and on Attu at the tip of the Aleutian chain, the security of Alaska was endangered. The Japanese and the Aleutians constituted a potential threat to the American mainland. To halt the Japanese advance along the island chain, an American force occupied Adak, only 250 miles from the Japanese on Kiska. The landing on Adak was made on August 30th, 1942. It marked the end of the period of strictly defensive operations for U.S. forces in the northern Pacific. From this point onward, American troops would be on the offensive in the Aleutians as elsewhere in the Pacific. To implement that offensive, the necessary materiel was brought up. The mounting of the advance against the Japanese in the Aleutians involved a heavy investment to the U.S. Much of the equipment was not suited to use in the Aleutians. The GIs who were to make the offensive were handicapped by the twin problems of terrain and weather, both abominable, especially for military operations. Just as important as the combat units to the success of operations in the Aleutians were the construction battalions. Building an airstrip in the northern Pacific was somewhat more of an operation than it was anywhere else. The work at Adak was rushed. From that island, American bombers could plaster the Japanese on both Attu and Kiska, softening up those islands for U.S. invasion. Throughout the Pacific, the construction of an airfield nearer Japan always signaled an important step forward toward eventual victory. Only 2 weeks after the GIs landed on Adak, the engineers put the finishing touches on the first airstrip. In January 1943, U.S. troops moved to Amchitka, only 50 miles from Kiska. In World War II, Army life was summarized in the phrase, hurry up and wait. This pattern of living was followed especially closely by the GIs in the Aleutians. Life at an Aleutians base was simply a succession of drab days, spent in the same rigidly monotonous routine. There were precious few hours each day when a GI felt as though he was still part of the human race. After a while, it was hard to keep track of the days and weeks. Every day was just like every other day. But sometimes there was a break in the weather. The change was usually for the worse. When a willowaw or Aleutian windstorm started blowing, all the GIs on the islands quickly battened down their shelters. Some of the men had seen some pretty strong twisters in the U.S., but nothing to compare with a full-scale willowaw. The Aleutian weather was, of course, a particular problem to the Air Force. On an average day, the weather ranged from poor to impossible. Keeping a North Pacific air base in operating condition was a job that required plenty of patience and determination. The job proved to be quite a novelty to those GIs who had spent all their time before the war in the southern states of the U.S. Some never would get used to the Aleutians. When there wasn't a willowaw to worry about, there was often snow to complicate flying conditions. And when there was snow at an Aleutian air base, everybody kept busy. Because of the frequency of thick fogs, the planes were able to fly missions against the enemy only on comparatively good days. And most of those were far from what was called ideal flying weather. The planes of the 11th Air Force were ready to take off on strikes against the enemy at a few moments' notice, whenever weather permitted. In late 1942 and early 43, all possible air power in the Aleutians was assigned to the job of knocking out Japanese positions on Attu and Kiska. The commanders of the units which were to bomb those islands carefully studied the latest air photographs of the areas. By picking as targets the facilities most vital to the enemy, the all-important airstrip, the seaplane hangar, coast defense guns, the Air Force could cripple Japanese offensive operations from their newly won bases. Before every mission, the pilots were briefed on their specific objectives. Then, when the weather permitted, they prepared to take off on the 250-mile hop to the target. No matter how good the weather report, the pilots could never be entirely sure that favorable conditions would hold over the target. Aleutian's weather was especially changeable, and the pilots had learned not to expect much in the way of continuing clear visibility. All they could do was head west and hope. The U.S. could not be sure of the extent of Japanese intentions in the North Pacific. The only way to keep the enemy from expanding his area of control was for 11th Air Force planes to bomb the enemy's installations on Attu and Kiska as frequently as possible. It had become apparent, even to the usually skeptical Navy, that air power was the key to victory in the Aleutians. The Air Force itself had come to the same conclusion somewhat earlier. As far back as 1922, General Billy Mitchell had said, Alaska could become the stepping stone of invasion from the Orient, and it can be defended only by air power. And in 1940, Colonel Buckner, Ground Forces Commander in Alaska, stated, "One squadron of heavy bombers is of more use to me than a division of ground troops." The regular bombing of Kiska was a major factor in the turning of the tide of battle in the Aleutians. Missions to Kiska were far from routine. Enemy anti-aircraft fire was heavy. On the early missions, bombing of targets was entirely visual. Special attention was given to plastering the Salmon Lagoon runway on the island. Constant bombardment of the strip hampered construction and prevented the Japanese from bringing in land-based heavy aircraft. Besides the heavy flak which the enemy threw up, the attacking bombers had to cope with Japanese fighters. killing the enemy was only half the battle. If the weather was clear over the target, there was a good chance that their base would be fogged in. The pilots in the 11th Air Force flew with the added mental strain of being aware every moment they were in the air that death from exposure would probably follow bailing out or a forced landing, even if they were lucky enough to land in one piece. After the flight back, the best sight in the world was the base control tower. Whatever the weather, each landing in the Aleutians was a new adventure, even for veteran pilots. Many of the 11th Air Force pilots who had been trained in Texas had to readjust completely to conditions in the northern Pacific. Since the complement of planes in Alaska and the Aleutians was fairly limited, the loss of even one plane would be keenly felt. The pilots always had to contend with fog, high wind, rain, or ice, always more of a hazard than the enemy. At Aleutian bases, emergencies were expected. Safely back on the ground, the flyers swapped shrapnel and stories about their experiences over the target. A successful raid on an enemy-held island made enduring the cold and the monotony worthwhile after all. In May 1943, a U.S. assault force moved toward Attu, the Japanese-held island at the tip of the Aleutian chain. On the morning of May 11th, the invasion force stood offshore. From U.S. submarines, Army scouts headed for shore in advance of the main landing force to reconnoiter the areas behind the landing beaches and to destroy enemy installations wherever possible. Then, shortly after 2 p.m., the warships laid down a barrage as cover for the main landing forces. After several delays, the Northern Force troops started ashore in mid-afternoon. Their landing was to be made at a point about 3 miles from the main Japanese camp on the island. Air support was extremely limited because of the heavy fog over Attu. On the southern side of the island, the main American force landed at the mouth of Massacre Valley. The 7th Division GIs felt somewhat uneasy about landing at a spot so forbiddingly named. A foothold was gained without opposition, but it was vital for the GIs to try to gain some of the high ground commanding the valley area before the battle with the enemy began. The men dug in, ready to fight for that beachhead. The high ground flanking the valley was dominated by the enemy. Japanese troops were outnumbered 5-1, but they held an important terrain advantage. The battle for Attu began late that first afternoon. U.S. weapons went into action against carefully prepared Japanese positions. The GIs were handicapped by equipment and clothing which proved unsuited to the demands of Aleutian weather and terrain. The enemy, on the other hand, was well prepared for this type of warfare. The Japanese fought savagely to retain possession of the strategic high ground. Some GIs almost gained the heights before being driven back by the enemy's withering fire. For 19 days, the battle for Attu raged on. Finally, after a last desperate banzai charge, the Japanese defense of the island was at an end. The frenzied enemy attack had carried the Japanese troops into the American lines, where they were virtually wiped out by Army engineers. Most of the remaining Japanese who were not killed in the hand-to-hand struggle committed suicide rather than surrender. After the annihilation of the Japanese force which had made the banzai charge, the Imperial Japanese High Command, 1,800 miles away in Tokyo, conceded defeat on May 30th. In the retaking of Attu by the U.S. Army's 7th Division and supporting units, 1,100 soldiers were wounded. 400 soldiers gave their lives in the battle for Attu.
O merciful God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who is the resurrection and the life, in whom whosoever believeth shall live, though he die, and whosoever liveth and believeth in him shall not die eternally. Who also hath taught us by his holy apostle St. Paul not to be sorry, as men without hope, for those who sleep in him. We humbly beseech thee, O Father, to raise us from the death of sin unto the life of righteousness.
With Attu once more in American hands, Kiska became untenable for the Japanese, and they abandoned the island in late July. The evacuation was conducted under cover of a heavy fog. The enemy ships were not detected by American patrol craft. On August 15th, a strong U.S. invasion force prepared to assault the island. Making the attack were the U.S. Army's 7th Division and supporting units of the Canadian Army and U.S. Western Defense Command. The GIs who were to spearhead the assault were warned to expect Japanese defenses about 7 times as formidable as those on Attu. The invasion troops were prepared to storm ashore and overpower the enemy. 7,000 U.S. troops went ashore within the first 14 hours. An additional 4,000 men were ready to land in support of the original force. Benefiting from errors made at Attu, the Kiska invasion had been carefully planned. The supplies and equipment which would be needed in short order by the fighting men started arriving on the beach quickly. After more than a year of fighting a holding action in the Aleutians with inadequate equipment, the U.S. had finally mounted an invasion force worthy of the term. Kiska was the consummation of all the effort that had been poured into the Aleutian War by the U.S. But the assault troops found no Japanese. There was considerable evidence of the effective work which had been done in the area by the U.S. Navy and Air Force. The enemy had been under heavy bombardment from sea and air for about a year before evacuating the island. Japanese equipment on Kiska indicated that the battle would have been a bloody one if the U.S. invasion had been made a month or 2 earlier. Many of the GIs felt relieved that the invasion had turned into a simple occupation. The Japanese had left suddenly, but not before booby-trapping the place thoroughly. In Japan, the enemy's war production was geared to a more and more demanding schedule as Japanese troops lost ground in the Pacific. Soon after the start of war with the United States and Western allies, the shortage of labor in Japanese war plants was aggravated. Only 3 months after the Pearl Harbor strike, labor conscription was put into effect, applying to everyone over 15 years of age of either sex. Factory workers could be moved from city to city as needed. The daily fixed rate of pay ranged from 1 yen to 1 3/5 yen, between 25 and 40 cents in U.S. money at the time. The working day was increased to 16 hours. The work week was a full 7 days. And in addition to the daily 16-hour stint, workers had to fill 2 night shifts each week. Women comprised the majority of Japan's war workers. Every available able-bodied person in Japan above elementary school age was pressed into war work. The energies and resources of all of Japan were concentrated on crushing the hated American enemy and winning a brilliant victory for the glory of Imperial Japan and its militarist leaders. With the Aleutians completely regained, the U.S. command turned its attention farther westward to the Kurile Islands. Paramushiro, the most important target, was bombed regularly by U.S. planes beginning in mid-1943. En route to the Kuriles, American pilots often practiced on Japanese ships. As they neared the Japanese islands, these opportunities increased. The 800-mile trip from the western Aleutians to the northern Kuriles soon became a routine mission. The principal targets at Paramushiro were airfields, fisheries, and canneries. All were given careful attention. From mid-1943 until the end of the war, 11th Air Force planes kept Paramushiro effectively neutralized. U.S. air power had successfully disrupted Japan's aggressive moves in the North Pacific. Below the equator, the job of pushing the Japanese back involved a different kind of warfare. In the jungles of New Guinea, Allied fighting forces were engaged in combat with the enemy from the early months of the war.
Go forward, men of courage in the freedom fight. Let justice reign and freedom song fill every heart with joy.
Between the Asiatic and American continents, more than 10,000 islands, large and small, rise above the surface of the Pacific Ocean. Many of the islands are the shells of once active volcanoes, which have lain dormant for centuries. Near the equator, many of the dots in the expanse of blue Pacific are atolls, chains of tiny coral islands strung in a ring around. In November 1943, it became urgent for U.S. forces to seize certain strategic atolls in the Gilbert Islands. Tiny strips of coral and sand, named Makin and Tarawa. The Japanese brought to the war in the Pacific their first-hand experience in combat gained on the Asiatic continent in the 1930s, in Manchuria and China. Through necessity, the Japanese soldier became practiced in adapting himself to any conditions, no matter how miserable. Though shorter than Oxa troops, the Japanese were husky and well geared to the demands of jungle. But the Nipponese fighting man also had a good working knowledge of more formal warfare. Early in World War II, the Japanese had gained the reputation of being fanatical fighting men. Before leaving the home islands of Japan, each soldier was thoroughly indoctrinated in Bushido, the way of the warrior. Under this code, the only honorable alternative to victory in battle was death, in the name of the emperor. On islands spread all over the far Pacific, Japanese fighting men had vowed to kill as many of the hated American enemy as possible, and to die rather than surrender. This fanatical will to die on the part of the individual Japanese fighting man was to make of the Pacific War a series of bloody engagements, stretching across thousands of miles of ocean to the shores of Japan itself. Some 9 million Japanese fighting men were dedicated to dying for their emperor and in honor of their ancestors. During World War II in the Pacific, many were to have that opportunity. At Quebec in August 1943, the state of the war was assessed by the Allies, and some basic agreements for the further prosecution of the war were reached. With relation to the war against Japan, Allied leaders concluded that it must be stepped up, and that it was advisable to begin at once a new avenue of attack through the Central Pacific. That important decision was to hasten the end of the war with Japan. In the Central Pacific, the Gilbert Islands were the first objective. Seizure of these islands on the equator was a necessity if the Central Pacific route was to be pursued successfully. The most urgent need before final planning of the operation began was for up-to-date air photographs of the islands. These indicated that the enemy was thoroughly entrenched in the Gilberts. One atoll, Tarawa, had been turned literally into a fortress. The enemy had transported heavy guns to the atoll and had carefully constructed defense positions. Navy photo reconnaissance officers realized at once that this would be no routine operation. Tarawa looked like a ring of steel. The next step in preparing for the invasion was to soften up the targets in the Gilberts, as well as neighboring islands with airstrips in the Marshalls. In October and November 1943, U.S. planes operating in the Central Pacific flew a series of raids on Japanese positions in the Gilberts and Marshalls. The crews were well prepared for opposition. It was apparent to all that the Japanese would fight stubbornly for their Central Pacific bases. The U.S. airmen were not disappointed. The principal targets in the marshals were the airfields, from which the Japanese planes operated, bases which were indispensable to the enemy's defense of the Central Pacific area. The enemy's Marshall Island bases were visited regularly by American bombers. From November 14th to November 21st, American Air Force bombers flew 13 missions to the Gilberts and Marshalls. In late November 1943, Cairo was the setting for a major conference of Allied government leaders. On that hot Egyptian autumn day, the conduct of the war against the enemy in the Pacific was being crystallized, the path to final victory charted. The U.S., England, and China were committed to a policy of unrelenting pressure against the Japanese. At the same time, on the front in China, the Japanese armies were driving ahead. While the Cairo conference was in session, Nipponese ground forces were attacking the Chinese in Hunan province. In those same late November days in Russia, the Red Army was picking up momentum in its drive to roll back the Nazi advance. By November 21st, Russian troops had advanced beyond the shores of the Dnieper. At the same moment, halfway around the globe, two American task forces from Hawaii and New Zealand were converging on the Gilbert Islands, a key position in the Japanese ring of outer defenses. The trip to the target was made in radio silence to lessen the chances of an attack by enemy planes or subs. In the two amphibious task forces, some of the units had to be refueled en route. That operation was often a delicate one. When a fighting ship needed fuel, the job had to be done, and promptly, regardless of what the weather was like. In the Southern Attack Force, en route from New Zealand, the Marines were briefed on every detail of Betio Island of Tarawa Atoll, where one of the Gilbert's invasions was to be made. These briefings were repeated so that every man would be well familiar with the island's topography and landmarks. The men put their spare time to good use. They were well aware that a weapon in top working order would often save their lives. As the ships neared the objective, the crews expected an enemy air attack. But the convoys were not disturbed by any organized enemy raid. Just before D-Day, the men dedicated their efforts. Soon after dawn on November 21st, 1943, the assault on the atolls began. At Makin, the bombardment by ships and carrier-based planes continued for almost 5 hours. One reinforced regimental combat team, the 165th of the Army's 27th Division, was to make the attack against Makin. This was the first taste of combat for the men in the assault waves. After the aerial bombing and strafing of the target and the supporting naval bombardment, the actual seizing of the objective was finally, as always, the job of the men with the rifles. The Army troops invading Macon had a 6 or 7-to-1 superiority in numbers and firepower. The soldiers landed against relatively light resistance. It became apparent that the enemy had not planned a strong defense of Macon against a sizable invasion force. Ashore on Butaratari Island of Macon Atoll, the soldiers encountered some opposition, but successfully overwhelmed the small enemy garrison. The island was taken by the men of the 165th Army Regimental Combat Team after 3 days of sporadic fighting. Many military men felt that the job should have been achieved in a shorter time, considering the light Japanese defenses. In any case, the enemy had been thoroughly wiped out at Macon. 100 miles to the south of Macon, Betio Island of Tarawa Atoll was the target for the southern attack force. Early on D-Day morning, the Navy went into action once more in an attempt to soften up the objective for the landing. The plan called for carrier planes to coordinate their attacks with the warship's bombardment and with the invasion pattern itself. But the schedule soon became upset, and the confusion on the timing of various elements of the attack had a calamitous effect on the operation. The Navy shelled the target island of Betio on D-Day morning for only 3 hours before the landing. The bombardment was heavy while it lasted, yet no one knew for certain, of course, what damage was being done to the enemy's defenses. Someone said confidently that not a Jap would be left alive on the island to contest the Marines' assault. Before dawn, the invasion vehicles started for the line of departure. The naval bombardment continued at intervals almost to each hour. The first waves of Marines, luckily, were in amphibian tractors. Succeeding waves were in landing boats. At the fringing reef, fate and the tides were against the Marines and the boats. The tide was lower than expected, and the boats were not able to clear the reef. Thus, a great percentage of the assault force was stuck 500 yards from the beach. Fortunately, the amphibian tractors, which carried the first assault waves, climbed right over the reef and continued into the beach. But on that eventful D-Day at Tarawa, the landing force had only about 100 amp tracks. These invaluable tracked vehicles made many trips from the reef to the shore before being knocked out by enemy fire. As each hour neared, carrier planes strafed enemy positions. The assault Marines continued toward shore, while the carrier pilots had one last crack at the enemy. At 9:10, the Marines of the 2nd Division landed on the enemy's fortress. The fight for a foothold on the tiny beach of Tarawa was tougher than anything the Marines had ever faced. Casualties were very heavy. This was the first Pacific invasion which was vigorously opposed on the beach. During those first bitter hours, it grew readily apparent that the fight for Tarawa was to be a battle of epic proportions. Of the hundreds of Marines who had been forced to wade into shore from the reef, many were cut down by the enemy's fire. But none had hesitated. Those who died were killed moving forward against the enemy. With the Marines at Tarawa, Time and Life correspondent Robert Sherrod was with the assault forces throughout the battle.
We got ashore all right. At least a lot of us did. But that was only the start. Except for our tiny beachhead, the enemy held the rest of the small island. They had to be dug out of their pillboxes and bunkers. We calculated that the chances of a man being killed or wounded within the hour were about 50-50. The enemy's defenses were incredible. Great coconut log bunkers. The job of getting the Japanese inside was left to the men on foot, men with rifles, grenades, and flamethrowers. We lost most of our flamethrowers trying to get ashore, but the ones we had left worked overtime. There was no such thing as a rear area in this battle. The enemy was always only a few yards away. The violence of Tarawa was stunning. The only way to get at the Japanese was to flush them out or kill them in their holes. The decisive factor at the turning point of the battle was the fighting spirit of the United States Marines. There were no greater heroes on Betio than the medical corpsmen. As the number of wounded passed 1,000, there was an overwhelming amount of work for them to do. As many wounded as possible had to be evacuated. The final count was 2,101 Americans wounded in action. On Tarawa, above all other islands of the Pacific, the devastation of modern warfare was laid out for all to see. There was some mopping up to do, as always after a battle. There were still caves to blow up or close up. Still some die-hard Japanese snipers to be routed out of their holes. On Tarawa, we encountered the fanaticism that we had come to expect of the enemy. "4,500 Japanese were killed on this tiny, stinking island. Altogether, only 17 Japanese surrendered, less than 1/2%. In addition, 129 Koreans gave up. They had served as laborers, but doubled as riflemen. The enemy soldiers always seemed surprised when they found that we didn't kill prisoners. Judging by the nature of the enemy as we had seen him in action, the road to Tokyo, still some 4,000 miles long, would be a rough one. For every prisoner taken on Betio, we would find hundreds of thousands of fanatical Japanese between Tarawa and Tokyo who were ready to fight to the death. The battle on this sandy square mile was the toughest single fight in the 167-year history of the Marine Corps. Whatever lay ahead, the lessons learned at Tarawa would prove invaluable in future operations against other islands closer to Japan. On November 24th, at 1:30 in the afternoon, only 76 hours after the first wave stormed the beach, the island was declared secure. The Stars and Stripes flew proudly over the island, which the Japanese had turned into a carefully constructed fortress. Nearby, there was a second flag raising. The Union Jack, flying from another coconut palm, proclaimed the return to British rule of Tarawa, the capital of the British Crown colony of the Gilbert and Ellice Islands. Two Marine generals named Smith, Holland and Julian, inspected the ruins. In one brief battle, 1,000 American Marines from a single division had given their lives so that other Americans on other enemy beaches might live and fight their way on across the Pacific. What I saw on Betio was, I am sure, one of the greatest works of devastation wrought by man. The enemy had boasted that he could hold this island against the owned-enquiries. Tons of bombs and shells fell on the tiny island of Betio and knocked out most of the Japanese heavy weapons. But in the last analysis, credit for the job of annihilating the enemy on Tarawa must go to the Marines who stormed ashore against deadly rifle and machine gun fire and fought the enemy at arm's length. Of the men who died here in glory, none died in vain, and all Americans can forever be proud of the name of Tarawa.
The objective had been seized, and the most important single part of that objective was the airstrip, from which the attack against the enemy could be carried forward more effectively. Before the last Japanese snipers were killed, the CBs were hard at work repairing the strip. The same day the island was termed officially secure, the first carrier-based fighter, a Hellcat, landed on the island. The assault Marines welcomed the first Navy pilot to the airstrip, now under new management. On November 25th, only 4 days after D-Day, the Marines began to leave the island. They had fought through 76 hours of the bloodiest battle the Marine Corps had ever experienced. A battle which was to rank with other historic American struggles. Belleau Wood, the Alamo, the Bonhomme Richard, Concord Bridge. On the tiny sand spit of Betio at Tarawa Atoll, under the equatorial sun in late November 1943, they had indeed made history. From the airstrips in the Gilberts, U.S. planes extended their range over the eastern Carolines and the eastern and central Marshalls. American bombers increased the frequency of their visits to the Marshalls, the island group next on the invasion timetable in the Central Pacific Theater. U.S. pilots in that area became most familiar with half a dozen atolls in the Marshall Group. The lessons learned at Tarawa were carefully remembered by the pilots who gave the Marshalls a pre-invasion going over. And the lessons learned at Tarawa and the Gilberts were to save the lives of thousands of Americans as U.S. forces pressed the attack on the road to Tokyo and final victory. Plunging deeper into enemy waters with each fresh assault, the U.S. Navy paced the attack in the amphibious drive toward the enemy's home islands. During World War II, the Navy made maximum use of two weapons which had not theretofore been used on a large scale by American forces. The carrier, with its complement of attack planes, and the submarine. The war at sea across the broad stretches of the Pacific was an exciting, enormously complex naval chess match.
Freedom and justice for